There's something there energetically that is the reveal of the system, the violence of the system, and also has a truth force in it that this is what it's willing to do to people, and this is what some of us are going to have to endure or are willing to endure.
In this ClimateGenn episode, I'm speaking with Extinction Rebellion co-founder Gail Bradbrook about the role of activism today and the inner world of those taking action that can and does result in severe imprisonment, and in some countries even death. Gail identifies her own position on taking risks and how, in her words, to live an honourable life in these times. Climate activists in the UK today risk prison sentences that we might expect to be handed out to people convicted of violent crimes, presenting a danger to society. But by silencing dissenting voices, the risk to society is that collective failings can be easily swept under the carpet. During COP21 in Paris, Naomi Klein pointed out that the pressure of activists between the failed COP in Copenhagen and COP21 in Paris created the momentum for countries to come together and sign the Paris Agreement. Since then, the world has changed dramatically, with climate impacts pushing the thresholds of safety for communities all the way around the world. The failure of countries to honour their Paris commitments is contributing to the severe climatic consequences we are seeing now. In a recent email I received, the case was put that activist calls for revolution are misplaced because we do not have the time to restructure our society before large impacts overwhelm our ability to adapt. However, many activist calls, like Gail here for instance, are for expanded democracy, such as the creation of civil assemblies, where citizens are given expert insights, allowing them to better inform policy. In this sense, the role of activism is to maintain momentum towards better policies that increase adaptation and resilience in as fair and equitable way as possible. With carbon emissions stubbornly high, we are seeing the rising trend of destruction. In the next ClimateGenn episode, I speak with climatologist Professor Hayley Fowler from the University of Newcastle and Chief Meteorologist at the UK Met Office, Paul Davies. We discuss their work bridging the gap between meteorology and climatology to enhance severe storm warning systems in order to save lives. Whether in Europe, North Africa, the US, Philippines, the Himalayas, or beyond, severe life-threatening storms are increasing in strength and frequency, in all cases posing an existential threat. Paul and Hayley discuss the intricacies of how these storms form and how they have found new ways to decipher critical signals within the expanse of noisy data. This episode will be available to subscribers very shortly and be public in a week's time. Thank you to all of subscribers and to everyone who has gotten in touch with feedback and episode suggestions. It's greatly appreciated. Remember, you can support this channel by subscribing on Patreon or YouTube, as well as by ordering my book Cop Out: How Governments Have Failed the People on Climate, which is available worldwide in paperback and audio. Cop Out is based on my UN COP reporting from Paris 2015 to Dubai 2023. I take the reader behind the scenes to witness firsthand how the failure of successive global climate summits has led us to this era of dangerous consequences. Thank you again for listening. Gail, it's great to see you again. Thank you very much for taking the time. I just want to start by asking you, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy recently used strong rhetoric that put addressing climate change at the center of government foreign policy making. Would you say that the new UK government is now aligning with the demands of activist groups like XR?
I think it's a relief to have this government rather than the previous government that we had, and there are positive steps forwards. And in fact, our third demand, which is less well known, which focuses on a citizens' assembly and an upgrade to democracy, there's also signs that the government might move in that direction as well. But I think that you have to really take a step back and look at the bigger arcs of history here, much longer time frames, and the economic context that all of these processes are sitting in, to understand that no so-called elected government, I mean, I don't really feel like we have a proper and functional democracy, is actually going to do what's needed in these times. So them doing less bad things is a relief, them doing some positive things is a relief. But even just this morning, there's talk about expanding airports, for example. So the economy will always trump things, and so if there are things that they feel that they can do, and it will somehow magically grow the economy, they may choose to do those things. But
Just building on that, then, can you identify some of the issues today? You've mentioned the airports that are likely to push individuals towards risking arrest and prosecution, as you've sort of personally done in recent years. What are the issues today?
I think when we're trying to not only decarbonize our systems, but also think about the destruction of nature, the biodiversity loss, and pollution, the growing pollution impacts as well across the world, there are many things that need to be dealt with. There tends to be a focus on decarbonising the production of electricity, which is helpful. It's a thing, but okay, what about transport? What about food? What about consumption levels? And these are the kinds of things that the processes push people towards further consumption, further flying, and aren't willing to really make the difficult decisions that would support people to transition towards a more plant-based diet as well. So all those agendas are still going to be on the table.
So that's where the activist communities will sort of target those particular areas to raise the profile of the discussion. Or
many loopholes that politicians like to leave themselves. So the idea that there should be no new oil and gas, for example, but there are already licenses that have been approved that should be revoked. There are high court fights over some of that stuff, but you will find ways in which they're sort of going around their stated policy to allow new licenses to take place. And so one of the things that Extinction Rebellion's doing, for example, is focusing on the insurance sector, because they are a kind of Achilles heel, if you like, in the whole system of capitalism. You have to insure projects, and there tend to be smaller organisations. So can we go after those as sort of linchpins in this system? So it's not just policy based. It's kind of like what helps this to stay in place that we can target.
when people take action and things that are basically putting yourself on the line, it's not something I imagine that a lot of people take very lightly these days, especially with sort of heavier sentences being handed down. What's the decision making and state of mind when you decide that you're going to do this, when you're going to intervene on a personal level, from your experience?
I mean, I think in terms of the risks that activists take, there are a number of factors there. One is this action going to be effective? And that's certainly part of what you think about. But bigger than that really is, does this feel like the right thing to do? And am I willing to shoulder the consequences, whatever they may be? And in the last few years, pushed for by the think tanks that operate out of Tufton Street, stink tanks we like to call them, they're funded by big oil and gas. They've been literally writing the legislation that deeply now criminalises activism. And so one went from a situation of, yeah, you might be risking jail, to, in some colleagues' cases, simply being on a Zoom call to try and organise something has led to conspiracy charges. The sentencing for things like public nuisance has increased. And so, people are looking at 5-year jail terms, could even be higher. So these should give some pause for thought, unfortunately, and they will have that effect to some extent. Is it a good idea for somebody to find themselves in jail for 5 years? What can they do from their jail cell? I have to say, dear old Roger Hallam is managing to run Zoom calls on Revolution, so maybe it's not all bad. I don't know when the system will work that out and try and close them down. I have to say I've wondered that. But my personal feeling about jail, just to say, and that side of the risk, is there have been people who made it the sort of theory of change. If we get lots of people in jail, the system will have to change. That's not personally how I see things. When lots of people are arrested and you create a big splash in the media, for some limited amount of time, you get some publicity and you change the conversation. What you actually have to do is undermine the system economically. So I don't particularly really stand by that theory of change. Where I more stand is I'm willing to go to jail if that's what it takes. So when I was in court last year, jail was certainly, I was threatened with it 4 times for just talking about climate change. And I went up to give up my evidence holding my prison bag. So I was willing. So I think there are people like me that just feel compelled to do what they feel needs to be done. And it comes from a place of deep morality. And I also think that's true of the other folks that get into jail, but there's something there that also thinks it's a theory of change. Some of us, it's just what we feel we need to do. There's a new section where they didn't expect that's what was going to happen, because in the meantime, the landscape's changed quite a lot. So I do feel like we have got some, I don't know this for sure, but we've got some activists inside that weren't quite expecting the level of sentencing that they got. In my view, there's something there energetically that is the reveal of the system, the violence of the system, and also has a truth force in it that this is what it's willing to do to people, and this is what some of us are going to have to endure or are willing to endure.
In your discussions and things, has there been a big impact of those unexpectedly long sentences on people that were involved and maybe have pulled back, or have just said, I'm actually all in on this, whatever, what this risk-taking element?
I'm closer to Extinction Rebellion than Just Stop Oil, and I think Just Stop Oil colleagues have done a phenomenal job in putting forward that case of taking action from a deeply moral and actually spiritual perspective. I don't see that stopping anytime soon, although some of the key organisers have been jailed, so that may slow things down, I'm not sure. I think people look at the sort of longer arc here and the need to keep the face of resistance there in the public eye. I was listening to Chris Hedges this morning, actually, brilliant talk. One of the things he was saying is this is not logical, this stuff. Sometimes you have to look like the maniac that is like, I'm not having this. It's not on me. I do not consent to this system, and it can do what it wants to me. So in history, people like Sophie Scholl, when the Nazis were running Germany, who took actions that were inevitably going to lead to their death, but they still did it. And they're the kind of people that I think we should look up to, actually. Not that we're trying to get ourselves killed, we're not trying to, but we have to have that level of determination. We're all going to die at some point. So how do you live an honourable life in these times?
To referencing the violence of the system, you don't have to go very far in any news broadcast to see the violence that's going on all around us, but also the climate impacts. As we're talking, I mean, the smoke outside is coming over from the Portuguese forest where I am, the floods in Central Europe, and you can go beyond that and just see the incredible climate impacts we're experiencing. And yet the policy is always akin to this junk tank, stink tank version of reality. How do you see the global policy in terms of the gap between the rhetoric? Is it closing, or do you think it's just as bad as it was 10 years ago, 5 years ago, or any time frame?
I think you have to look systemically at the situation that we're in. The way I describe it is systematized trauma. There's a word called wetiko that comes from the Algonquin languages that's a mind virus. It's kind of the domination of the left hemisphere in its hungry ghost and its addictive self, right? And we have a capitalist consumerist culture that makes us very narcissistic and want. It's a very stupid, inhumane, ugly, dominated and controlling system, and it's probably been running in some form for at least 5,000 years. So it's not new, but we're in the end times of it. It's been eating up the planet for some time and destroying cultures and extracting from communities. And so the kind of people that find themselves in specific positions of power or being billionaires or whatever, they're likely to be Machiavellians, more likely sociopathic narcissists. That's what this system will select for. And it's the level at which you're willing to be co-opted by this system. And then also you're talking about the violence in this system and the climate impacts. Look at the climate impacts of the military and the weapons that we're supplying to the Palestine-Israel genocide at the minute, and what's happening to colleagues in Palestine Action as well, and to journalists, etc. This is authoritarianism. It's not hidden, and that is the direction of travel of capitalism in its later phases is going to stop being any version of free or liberal freedom that some of us are used to, and it's going to increasingly clamp down and become more authoritarian. So what are we going to do instead? That's the big question. And I think part of that is looking beyond global north stories about where power also lies across the world. Our global south family are not only in victimhood of this system and its extraction, they are rising up in various places across the world. I did have the honour and the carbon footprint, let's own that, of being invited to visit Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger earlier this year to meet with the revolutionary struggles that are happening at the minute. And you have got very sort of shifting sands in geopolitics that could well make big waves in our global economic system. As an example, those countries are saying that they are not willing to have their resources extracted for next to no money, and they're not willing to pay colonial debts. Those two things really are a just transition. That's what a just transition would mean, but it's global south-led just transition. That's how I see it. So I think we have to look beyond our own borders, as it were. We talk to think about our politicians. I don't think this is our government, our politicians. I think this is a rotten set of what happens within a disgusting system, and let's look to our family actually across the world, and let's look where agency and power lies.
And when you do that, when you look across the global south and beyond victimhood, are you enthused? Are you genuinely positive that we stand a chance of system change? Because the structural changes we've been calling for God knows how long are just they're not going to come. I mean, it's ridiculous to believe in a COP system.
If you read Jason Hickel, who works with a Senegalese economist called Ndongo Samba Sayal, who's also what you'd call a modern monetary theorist, they're looking at unilateral decolonisation. And what Jason says is that degrowth will happen when the global south stops paying its debts and starts to create its own currency. And this process of de-dollarization that's being led by the BRICS, and I'm not celebrating all the nasty patriarchs that are part of the BRICS, but there's an emergent sort of more multipolar world, and that's why we're having these sort of military conflicts, as there are underlying shifts that will disempower the elites that have been running the order for some years. But then, of course, what you do get is a sort of fight on the right, as it were. Those of us that come from a sort of more progressive perspective have to be looking at the places where we can really get organised as things fall to pieces, because I don't imagine it's going to be pretty or straightforward, this falling to pieces. So I think there are things to celebrate in the global south. I mean, the brilliant climate leadership, for example, of Petros and his deputy in Colombia. There are other parts of the world where there's active resistance that's been sustained for many generations, actually, to keep away the kind of extractive capitalist hegemony. But I do think we have to look to all possible routes for making change at this time. So it includes family, but it's not like, oh, they're going to sort it out in the global south. It's what can we do as well.
You talked about organisation, you talked about engaging in conversation. Is there anything emerging, any, I suppose, structure or anything that is creating that forum or that place where these organisations and conversations are taking place?
Sure. So, I mean, some of the young ones that I work with look at the miseducation system as part of this. Like, where are we taught to think? Are we taught critical thinking skills? Where are we taught to place our focus and our understanding? In fact, what our Pan-African colleagues call overstanding. You understand things in context, in historical and current context, right? So there's a miseducation system. So part of what we need to do is decolonize our education system. And there's a grouping called PRELA, the Planet Repairs Action Learning Education Revolution. And as part of that process that's Global South led, there's a group from Peru, a group of women from a women's peasant organisation coming over to meet with activists this autumn. You can find out more on prela.net. That's a sort of 100,000 plus feminist organisation in Peru. And I think it's just good for us to connect our struggles here directly with family in other parts of the world. That's going to be part of the change that comes.
It's becoming a sort of more tangible, and these organisations are obviously growing if there's over 100,000 members. It's been really interesting to speak to you. Thank you very much.
Please consider subscribing to ClimateGenn, and if you haven't already, order a copy of Nick's book, Cop Out today.